Founder of Demonic Cultivation. An English translation by Fan EE 33. Read by Luna Minerva. Chapter 7. Pride, Part 3. In the end, after caressing his ring for a time, Jiang Cheng forced his hostile emotions down. Though he was very unhappy, he was a sect chief and had to consider the repercussions of his actions. He couldn't be impulsive like boys such as Jinling. The decline of the Jiang sect had left only 3 great sects remaining, and among them the Lan sect and the Guosu Lan sect were the closest due to the deep personal bond between their 2 chiefs. On the other hand, Jiang Cheng controlled the Yunmeng sect alone, and his sect was relatively isolated. Lan Wangji was a highly distinguished figure in the cultivation world, and his elder brother, Lan Wangji, was the chief of the Guosu Lan sect. The 2 brothers had a strong, harmonious relationship. If Jiang Cheng didn't need to destroy his standing with them, it was best not to. Moreover, Jiang Cheng's sword San Du had never truly met Lan Wangji's Bichen in battle. Thus, the final outcome of such a clash was unclear. And though he had the mighty ring Zidian around his finger, Lan Wangji's Wangji Qin also had a fearsome reputation. Jiang Cheng couldn't tolerate being at a disadvantage. Without complete assurance of his victory, he wouldn't consider fighting Lan Wangji. Jiang Cheng stopped stroking the ring and slowly withdrew his left hand. It seemed Second Master Lan was intent on intervening, so continuing to play the villain would cause him trouble. For now, he would simply remember this incident. Done weighing the pros and cons, Jiang Cheng turned and saw Jinling still angrily covering his mouth. "Just accept Han Guangjun's punishment this one time. After all, the opportunity to discipline another clan's disciples is a rare one indeed." His tone was sneering, but it was unclear who he was sneering at. Lan Wangji never opened his mouth in response to such provocations. He merely acted as though he hadn't heard it. Jiang Cheng's next words were wrapped in thorns. "Why are you still standing there? Are you waiting for prey to rush toward you and stick themselves on your sword? If you can't capture whatever's living in Dafan Mountain, don't ever come to see me again." Jinling shot Wei Wuxian a venomous glare, but he didn't have the courage to glare at Lan Wangji, the one responsible for his forced silence. Placing his sword back into its scabbard, he made polite goodbyes to the 2 seniors opposite him and retreated with his bow in hand. Lan Wangji said, "Chief Jiang, the Guosu Lan sect will, of course, return the exact number of spirit-binding nets that were destroyed." Jiang Cheng smiled coldly. "No need." He chose to reverse course and take a leisurely stroll down the mountain. His disciples followed behind him silently, their faces miserable and marked with anxiety, knowing that when they returned, there would be no way to avoid their sect chief's wrath. Once their silhouettes disappeared in the distance, Lan Jingyi said, "How could Chief Jiang act like that?" Only once he finished did he remember the Lan clan's prohibitions against speaking about someone behind their backs. Scared, he glanced at Han Guangjun, closed his mouth and shuffled backwards. Lan Wangji smiled slightly at Wei Wuxian and said, "Young Master Mo, we meet again." Wei Wuxian pulled on the corners of his lips, but Lan Wangji opened his mouth and issued a command. It was clear and concise, free of any ornamentation. "Complete your task." Only then did the flock of juniors remember why they had come to Dafan Mountain. Placing any other thoughts at the back of their minds, they reverently awaited further instructions. A few moments later, Lan Wangji spoke again. "Try your hardest. No recklessness." His voice was low and magnetic. The heart of anyone standing near enough would undoubtedly tremble upon hearing it. The juniors obediently followed Han Guangjun's orders and walked deeper into the mountain forests, too afraid to linger. Jiang Cheng and Lan Zhan were truly completely different people, Wei Wuxian thought. Even the advice and the warnings they gave their juniors were completely contrary. As he was pondering this, Lan Wangji suddenly gave him a slight, almost invisible nod, and Wei Wuxian couldn't help but become slightly dazed. Ever since he was young, Lan Wangji had been so serious and deadpan, it made Wei Wuxian's head hurt. He was grave, inflexible, and seemed like he had never had a spontaneous moment in his life. Defects of behavior were like grains of sand in his eyes. He couldn't stand them. Thus, he had met the news that Wei Wuxian had taken up demonic cultivation with the harshest disapproval. But Lan Sijue should have already informed Lan Wangji about Mo Xuanyu's suspicious behavior at Mo Manor, yet the senior Lan had still nodded in greeting, most likely to thank him for helping the Lan juniors with their earlier trouble. Without thinking, Wei Wuxian returned the greeting, but when he lifted his head again, even Lan Wangji's shadow had disappeared. After a pause, he turned around and began to walk back down the mountain. No matter what kind of prey was lurking around Dafan Mountain, he couldn't pursue it. If Wei Wuxian was going to fight anyone over it, he wouldn't fight Jinling. It had really been Jinling. Wei Wuxian had not expected that, of all the Lanling Jin sect's disciples, he would happen to run into Jinling. If he had known, how could he have used words like, "You weren't raised by a mother," to mock the boy? If someone else had said such a thing, he would have made them understand exactly what bringing disaster upon yourself meant. But the one who had spoken then was Wei Wuxian himself. After a moment of stillness, he lifted his hand and slapped himself in the face. The slap resonated inside his skull, and his right cheek stung from the force of it. Suddenly the bushes behind him rustled. When Wei Wuxian glanced at the source of the noise, a donkey's head emerged through the leaves, and, for once, the donkey shuffled towards Wei Wuxian's hanging hand out of its own free will. He pulled on its long ears and laughed bitterly. "You wanted to save the pretty maiden, but forced me to play the hero." As the donkey whined and grumbled, a wave of cultivators crested over the mountain slope, heading directly towards them. Once every one of the 400 spirit-binding nets had been cut by Lan Wangji's flying blade, all the cultivators who had originally loitered around Fujiao village began surging up the mountain. All of these people could be considered Jinling's competitors, so Wei Wuxian briefly considered forcing them to retreat again. But in the end, he quietly let them pass. Dressed in a random assortment of clan colors, the crowd of disciples grumbled loudly as they climbed. "Both Clan Jin and Clan Jiang spoiled that young Master Jin rotten. Even at his young age, he's already so arrogant and tyrannical. In the future, if the Lanling Jin sect falls into his hands, it'll only end in upheaval and rebellion. We might as well die." Wei Wuxian slowed. A soft-hearted female cultivator sighed. "But how could they not spoil him? He lost both his mother and father at such a young age."
"Ah, sister, you can't talk like that. So what if both his mother and father are gone? The world is full of people who've lost both their parents. If everyone acted like he does, it would be a catastrophe."
Wei Wuxian sure went after whoever he wanted. Jinling's mother was none other than Jiang Cheng's sister by blood, and the one who had looked after him since he was small. Jiang Yanli was so unlucky to have raised such an ungrateful wild dog. Jin Sixuan had it even worse. Look at how horribly he ended up, just because he and Wei Wuxian once had a few petty feuds. It seems like everyone had some kind of feud with him. Exactly. Other than the crazed wolves he raised, have you ever heard of him having a good relationship with anyone? He has enemies everywhere. He's pretty much despised by all of the earth and the heavens. Even Han Guangjun and him hated each other. On sight like fire and water. Speaking of which, if it hadn't been for Han Guangjun today... Wei Wuxian walked for a while, when suddenly the soft sound of a running creek streamed into his ears. He hadn't heard this noise when he had walked up the mountain. Only now did he realize he had forked off onto some other route on his way down. Holding on to the donkey's reins, he approached the creek. The moon shined through the branches overhead, on which not a single leaf hung to offer cover. The water in the middle of the creek was choppy and frosty white. Glancing at its reflection, Wei Wuxian saw a face that changed unpredictably with the flow of the water. Viciously he slapped the surface with his open palm and shattered his absurd comical visage. Raising his dripping hand, he began rubbing off the powder with the creek water. It took only a few scoops. When his reflection appeared again, he saw a very elegant and handsome young man. Now clean, his face looked as though it had been bathed in moonlight. His brows were relaxed, his eyes clear and bright, and the corners of his mouth were upturned into a slight smile. But as he was bowed over the creek, intently examining his reflection, the beads of water decorating his lashes seemed like endlessly falling teardrops. This face was young and strange. It wasn't the face which had once drowned the earth and overturned the heavens, nor the face that caused foul winds to blow and hot blood to pour from the skies above. It wasn't the yearling Lao Tzu Wei Wuxian's face. After staring at this face for a long while, Wei Wuxian rubbed it again a few more times, massaged his eyes, and thudded back onto the shore. It wasn't that he couldn't endure others' harsh tongues and nasty words. After all, when he had first made his decision, he had understood perfectly clearly the kind of road that lay ahead. His mind had long reminded him, remember the motto of the Yunmeng Jiang sect, attempt the impossible. Only he had believed his heart to be an unmovable stone, yet in the end humans were not rocks or vegetation. The little donkey seemed to recognize his low mood and, for once, didn't impatiently moan and bray. After a moment of silence, it whipped around and began walking away. But Wei Wuxian continued sitting by the creek side, displaying no reaction, so it glanced back at him and stomped its hooves. Still, Wei Wuxian ignored it. Angry, the donkey could only return, bite down on the front of his robes, and drag him away. Leaving or staying, either was fine to Wei Wuxian, but since the donkey was now pulling him with its teeth, he figured he might as well follow. The donkey hauled him beneath a few trees, then paced in circles around a patch of vegetation. Within the underbrush, a Qian bag was quietly hidden. A ruined golden net hung above his head. Some unfortunate cultivator had almost certainly dropped the bag as they struggled free of the trap. Wei Wuxian picked it up and took a look inside. It contained quite a few miscellaneous items, such as gourds of medicinal wine, talismans, little fey-reflecting mirrors, and so on. After digging through it for a while, he grabbed a talisman, which suddenly burst into flame in his hand. The talisman had a yin ignition seal written on it, which, as the name implies, automatically ignited upon contact with yin energy. The stronger the yin energy, the bigger the fire. Since it started burning as soon as Wei Wuxian had removed it from the bag, there had to be a dark spirit nearby. As soon as he had seen the firelight, Wei Wuxian's attention became concentrated on guarding against the spirit. Lifting the talisman, he tried waving it around in different directions. Turning east, the fire dimmed, whereas turning west, the flame suddenly jumped up higher and higher. He walked a few steps in that direction and saw a stooped white figure emerge under a nearby tree. Ashes fell from Wei Wuxian's fingertips as the paper burned completely up. The figure was an elderly man with his back turned on him, muttering. As Wei Wuxian slowly drew near, the old man's mutterings became clearer. "Oh, it hurts, it hurts." "Where does it hurt?" Wei Wuxian asked. The old man replied, "Oh, my head, it's my head." "Let me see," Wei Wuxian said. He walked a few steps to the old man's side and saw a bloody red hole in the middle of his forehead. This was a dead soul, and the murderer had probably killed him by smashing some kind of weapon into his skull. He wore burial clothes of high-quality material and strong craftsmanship, which meant he had already been properly interred. This wasn't the lost soul of some living person. But this kind of soul shouldn't be appearing on Dafan Mountain. It defied all logic, and Wei Wuxian couldn't come up with any explanation. But it was anything but reassuring. He hopped onto the donkey's back, slapped its hindquarters, gave a holler, and spurred it onwards towards the place where Jinling had gone up the mountain. Many cultivators dithered around the old burial mound, intent on waiting for their prey to show up on its own, rather than taking decisive action. Some of them had bravely raised a yin-summoning flag, but it only attracted a swarm of spirits who did nothing except wail so loudly all of the earth and sky could hear them. Pulling on the donkey's reins, Wei Wuxian glanced around and asked in a clear, bright voice, "Excuse me, could you please tell me something? Where did the little masters from Clan Jin and Clan Lan go?" Now that he had washed his face, one of the cultivators responded promptly, They left this place and went to the shrine of the Heavenly Maiden." "Shrine of the Heavenly Maiden?" Wei Wuxian said. After the family of cultivators he had saved heard about the destruction of the spirit-binding nets, they quietly snuck up the mountain again, and were also among the people who had gathered to patrol the old burial mounds. The middle-aged man, seeing Wei Wuxian's clothes and his toothy donkey, thought Wei Wuxian was probably the lunatic who had rescued them earlier. Quite embarrassed, he pretended nothing had happened, but the round-faced young woman pointed and gave directions. "Over there. It's a shrine inside a cave in the mountain." Wei Wuxian questioned her more closely. "Which divinity was the temple built for?" The round-faced young woman said, I think the statue of the Heavenly Maiden appeared naturally." Wei Wuxian nodded. "Thank you very much." He rushed to the shrine at once. The marriage of the lazy bum, the lightning strike that had split open coffins, the fiancé who had been bitten to death by wolves, the successive loss of the souls of a father and daughter, the beautiful burial clothes, they were like matching pearls finally strung together. No wonder the evil wind compasses hadn't picked up anything. The yin-summoning flags were even more useless. They had all underestimated the thing on Dafan Mountain. It wasn't at all what they thought it was.